I'm Avi Holzman. For the sake of this, I am one of Omiula's great-grandchildren.
I'm Talia. I'm Allie's cousin. My mom and her dad are siblings.
I'm Nicole Holzman. I'm Allie's proud aunt.
I am Max Safel, brother to Nicole Safel Holzman.
Okay, well, the way that you described it, it sounded like I was supposed to do, like, a medieval times introduction. Like, I am Nikki Safel, son of Max Safel, great-grandson of Omiula.
So Omiula, who is my grandmother, her real name was Ursula Hengius Kohn. We referred to her as Omiula.
I'll summarize it the way I know it. She was born in Germany in the 20s.
She was born in 1921 in Berlin, Germany, to a Jewish father and a Lutheran mother.
And they decided to have a Jewish home.
Not super religious, the kind of religious like where they would go to synagogue, but then her dad would come home and eat pork. A pretty affluent family.
In 1937, the Hitler regime and the Third Reich entering into Germany, taking power.
And they kind of got tipped off by the Nazis. They came, took one book of a stamp collection and said, we know you have another, we'll come back in 2 weeks. They decided to try and leave much earlier than 2 weeks and kind of escaped out the back door as the Nazis were walking in the front.
So in 1937, they fled Germany.
He had a stamp collection that were worth money. He wanted to use that to buy tickets.
At the time they could leave, Jewish immigration laws didn't end until 1939.
I remember Omiula describing entering the port of Cartagena as, a young girl and seeing things such as palm trees and beaches and realizing that in German there are no words for that. There are now. But at that time there weren't, because that just didn't exist. And she didn't even know what to call those things and what they were. And it was just pretty astounding.
All their money was spent on the journey. So they were dirt poor when they ended in Bogota. And she got married about, I want to say, a year or two later.
When she was 16 years old, she married a man who was of German-Dutch heritage.
And then she had 2 children. One of them was my uncle, Wolfgang, and he was the older one. And then 18 months later, my mother was born, Ingrid.
And he turned out to be an abusive alcoholic.
We have her divorce papers, which is pretty amazing that a woman in that time went through the legal channels to actually divorce him. She was, I would say, a pretty ballsy lady.
Eventually, after the war was over, there were reparations allowed for German Jews that were forced to flee. So at that point, my family broke up.
And then ended up in New York, worked at Lenox Hill Hospital as an orderly for 50 years.
When she was 40 years old, she had a patient, and he was Argentinian, and she met him and fell in love, and that would become her longest lasting love.
Alberto Kursel. He lived with her the majority of her life. They were longtime partners.
And then grandchildren came along, and then great-grandchildren came along.
And then she moved to Maryland when she was in her 80s.
She lived there until she passed away at the age of 101.
It was pretty incredible that she was really with it until the last, I would say, 4 to 6 months of her life.
Yeah, that's a brief recap of her life. It wasn't so brief, but I could have gone on so much longer. What's identity? Define that for me.
I don't think she was the kind of person to explicitly comment on her identity. She definitely was the kind of person to implicitly, she liked her German culture.
She detested Hitler and she detested what was done to her people, but she didn't detest Germany. She still loved Germany.
I remember when the World Cup happened, the final match was between Argentina and Germany. And so we asked her, who was she going to root for, the Argentinian team or the German team? Because Abuelito, Argentinian. And she was like, no, of course, the Germans. Always the Germans.
I would say her fondest memories of all the stories that she would tell, all of her fondest memories were in Colombia.
I think she was proud of her Latino influence on her life, but also Like, certainly not as proud as she was of being German. And I think, that makes sense to me because she was Latino not by choice. When you're a refugee like that, you don't really get a choice whether or not you like your identity. You kind of just have to.
Really, really happy and content to be a Colombian.
And in terms of her American citizenship, I think it was more like out of convenience. Like she finally ended up in this country.
I feel like she was pretty indifferent on being a U.S. citizen.
And I heard her say negative things about Americans and about the American way of life, but she was never proudly American.
When it comes to religion, among Jews that survived the Holocaust, there's a tremendous rejection of religion.
She liked going to synagogue. She really liked going to synagogue on the high holidays, which that makes sense, but also really liked going on Hanukkah, which I think makes a little less sense. Maybe that's like the American Judaism wearing off on her.
So I think in some regards, a chameleon is a great way to describe her. She fit in Germany. She fit in Colombia. She fit in New York. She fit in here in Maryland. She could fit in a church and she could fit in a temple. I think she was much, much more interested in making the connection with people, and regardless of the country or the place or the institutions to which they belonged.
Ethnicity? So that, I say I'm Hispanic and white. Or like Hispanic American.
My own ethnicity, I would call myself white or Caucasian.
It's a hard one. I mean, it's like what you check off on the forms, Sometimes I change my answer.
I definitely check off Hispanic. I definitely feel like my first language is Spanish and German.
We're this kind of like Latino identity.
My mom would call herself a Latina. I don't think I would call myself a Latino. And that has always been a little bit weird.
Sometimes when I start speaking Spanish and someone's like, oh, you speak Spanish, like your accent, it's good, where are you from? And so then they're like, oh, are you like Latina? And I'm like, I don't know. You tell me. Like, I have no idea.
I felt some of that frustration, and I think it comes through in language, knowing that my language skills aren't 100%. It's I have this identity, but I can't always express it in words.
On a DNA level, sure, I feel German. But at the same time, like, the Germans kicked my family out, They hated us for who we were. And so it's hard to connect with an identity that maybe doesn't connect back.
It's interesting to me that my mom's really impressed the Spanish thing on me, or I guess tried to. It hasn't really stuck. But no one in my family's ever really impressed the German thing on me.
But realistically, I'm mostly American.
Born here, raised here, definitely attached to that.
Like, I just don't feel American. I don't know how else to say it. I didn't grow up with your typical of American pop culture, but, maybe some of it, not a ton of it. And my mother is a formidable force. And so she was not American. And so she set the tone of the house.
Hereditarily Jewish is definitely an interesting one, because grew up Catholic, turned atheist, but then in recent times kind of started following Judaism a little bit closer.
I feel Jewish. Like, that's the easiest one for me to be like, yes, I'm Jewish.
Strongly agnostic, but with a affiliation towards Judaism. I've been embraced by my brother-in-law's community, and him being a rabbi at Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation.
Being Jewish for me was never a question, in part because of my dad's job. I used to sit on the bima and look at the audience, which is like really odd for a kid to do, but that's just like what I wanted to do.
But I would say my Jewish journey hasn't stopped, and it helps create and build community.
There's something about the Jewish experience that is a collective. Like, Judaism is based off of community.
I mean, I feel a really strong connection to my identity when I'm with my family. When I'm with your family at your house or my house, we're all eating dinner.
And all of her stories are always about being with other people and having fun.
One thing I think about is I feel like I walk around school sometimes with a chip on my shoulder, and I'm not quite sure why. And now that we're talking about it, Omiula walked around her life with a big chip on her shoulder.
She never let anyone silence her. Like, her life was her life. Like, she never let anyone take that from her. Her abusive husband, the Nazis, anyone. She never let anyone take that from her.
But just this persistence of tales and stories of being able to meet people and then immediately becoming friends with them.
That's just how she connected to the world around her, because she had no other option. Like, she could have chosen to, be bitter and sad about it and to hate Germany forever and just be full of spite, but she chose to love life anyways.
But there's certainly parts of my identity that are not fully formed that I'm still thinking about.
I think I'll feel I don't know maybe the rest of my life. Like, I think these are questions that I'll never fully answer, but I think that's part of being human, is that identity is something that constantly shifts and evolves based off of life experience. I'm sure if, you asked Omiula if she felt Colombian when she was born, she'd say, no, never. Why would I? But, at the end of her life, maybe that answer changed.